One of the first things you should probably know about me is that I love Fire Emblem, and that naturally extends to its characters. Spending hours upon hours with them in battle and reading their interactions makes it kinda hard not to get attached to these guys, and there are quite a lot of them too. Which also means they can't all be winners. But before I get into some of those not winners, I'd like to clear a few things up. I'll only be considering characters from these games. Any Fire Emblem game that precedes these tend to have bland, underdeveloped casts by the series' current standards, so no one from these games really stands out to me as particularly bad. And speaking of things to consider, I won't bother to discuss a character's usefulness in battle as to how much I dislike them. This list is about characters who are narrative entities above anything else, so I'll only be referring to them as such. And because you're a human who isn't me, you're bound to see some things here you don't agree with. And by all means, let me know why. Get a discussion going, just keep it cool and we'll get along alright. Now please, join me as I rip into my least favorite Fire Emblem characters. Or don't. Your call, really. Path of Radiance has some amazing characters, arguably the best Fire Emblem cast to date. They stand out, they're unique, they're funny, they're layered, it's a quality ensemble here, to such a degree that I can almost forget how badly many of them were butchered in Radiant Dawn. Most characters who returned for the sequel were simply diluted, relegated to the background after having been fleshed out in the first game. Astrid, however, is another beast entirely. Astrid in Path of Radiance was a new recruit in a group of knights who started fighting in order to prove a point to her upper-class family, to make a life of her own instead of taking the path arranged for her. Though naive, the game emphasizes her incredibly generous nature mixed with her resolve, and I rather like her. So you know what you don't do when bringing her back for the sequel? Betray everything she stood for and relegate her to an insufferable douche carpet's extremely stupid babysitter. That's a good place to start. Though she shows up in a grand total of 2 scenes, her scant screen time in Radiant Dawn is spent cleaning up after and singing the praises of an irresponsible drunk who cares nothing for her in return. And that's it. So where did that determination go? Where did that genuine sweetness go? Is this even the same person? I mean, certain bits of info do contradict each other between games, so that's a fair question. It's one thing that Astrid as depicted in Radiant Dawn is an offensively bad character. It's another thing entirely that she changes so much between games that she manages to go back on everything that she previously was. And to think she pulled this off before Samus Aran did it in 2010. Fire Emblem likes to set trends where you least expect it. The Sacred Stones is a very okay game with very okay map designs and laughably bad AI and very okay characters. Oh, except the protagonists. They suck. Between Erica and Ephraim, this isn't a question of which one I dislike more. I dislike both, and equally at that. One is an impossibly sweet and peace-loving princess, and the other is an impossibly charismatic fighter. Based on that alone, you can already tell what kind of dynamic they have. But just because they're well-worn archetypes doesn't mean they can't be good, right? Only if you decide not to task the world's laziest writers with your upcoming game script, which is apparently what Intelligent Systems did. Neither of their developments actually affect their behavior, and both character arcs are piss in the wind. We'll start with Erica, whose development path begins with diplomat-turned-reluctant fighter and ends with experienced lady of war who learns that fighting is necessary to protect her people and her brother. Except, she's kinda ineffective, and needs to be rescued a lot, and is really dumb when the plot needs her to be. And her growth and journey are pointless because Ephraim is an obnoxiously perfect fighter and strategist who can get out of any situation when the plot needs him to. Now his development, you'll love this. He's fearless and perfect at everything, to the point that he charges into enemy territory and can take care of himself just fine. But that gets to his head, so when he frees his country from the invading force, it turns out the people don't actually like him much. And that doesn't affect him in any way. Oh, but then he finds out that his perfection gave Lion his inferiority complex. And that's disregarded too. So we have Erica, who's made out to be weak and can't do anything, and Ephraim, who's made out to be absurdly overpowered and can do everything. Are you seeing the issue here? I didn't just put them in the same spot because they're both killed by poor development subject to the whims of plot convenience, but because their dynamic actually hurts each other as characters. Whereas a good writer would have played with their familiar archetypes and taken their characters in interesting directions, Sacred Stones accentuates their respective tropes. Any potential development is rendered meaningless and thrown away in favor of just making them into plot devices who don't always behave in character. They're almost good, and they certainly would have been much better if a little more time was spent developing each protagonist, but instead they're two of Fire Emblem's most lazily written and least likable characters. At least their sibling banter is funny. Of all the characters on this list, Rinka is the one I most desperately wanted to like. You see, this design? This is one of the best designs that has ever been conceived for the series. It's fan service with a difference, and a woman with muscular definition in a video game is refreshing to see. And she's one of only 2 axe users in Birthright, so, best to learn to love her. And I tried. I really, really tried. But after 2 runs of Birthright and 2 of Revelation and using her every single time, I just couldn't force it any longer. Why is that, you ask? Because she has got to be one of the most underwhelming and flat characters in Fates. She's the only one in your group who's from the Flame tribe, so she's isolated from everyone else. So when she supports, combine this with her grumpy personality, and there you go, hilarity ensues or whatever. Except, no it doesn't, because it's the same every time. Rinka, you're isolated. You should do this thing. No, leave me alone. Oh, okay, I'll prove a point to you anyway. Wow, thank you, I'm so enlightened now. By the way, can I get in your pants, please? Nearly every single one of her support chains plays out the exact same way, and you want to kill yourself when you notice how repetitive this gets. In the right hands, this could have been funny and contribute to genuine development for her, but it all just feels so unnatural and uncomfortable, especially when she suddenly falls for whoever's been pestering her. I guess it's just common practice in the Flame tribe to rub genitals with someone you don't like very much. And the few support chains of hers that don't play out like this simply are not interesting. By all means, she could have been good and I wanted her to be good, but all of her potential is quickly thrown under the bus for repetitive schlock that does nothing and goes nowhere. What a waste of a great design! At least her support chain with Orochi was okay. One of the least notable characters in Path of Radiance was a thief named Soth. He showed up looking for an unnamed person and the game promptly forgot about him after the fact. But that's okay, he'd get a chance to see his story resolved in Radiant Dawn. Right? Yeah, Soth did feature more prominently in the sequel, but it didn't go very well, to the point where it would have been preferable if he had stayed out of focus. The idea was that he'd be the bodyguard, right-hand man, and best friend of the protagonist, Micaiah. Not a bad idea. And I give him this, the two can have interesting exchanges when they have different perspectives, but that is as far as his influence goes because he is such a one-dimensional attack dog, such a simplistic yes man, that it skips admirable loyalty and just goes into being straight-up obnoxious. Nothing he says goes anywhere or means anything. He rescues Micaiah when the plot needs to get her out of a tough spot, that's it. His overwhelming obedience to her, his adamant refusal to protest even when he thinks she's being unreasonable, makes them seem more like a master and her servant than actual friends who have each other's backs. And yet for all of his obsessive devotion, for all of the time he spends hanging around Micaiah, he contributes little if anything to the plot. It's just as well that he's a useless unit that the game forces you to drag into the last few maps because in both the gameplay and the story, Soth is the embodiment of dead weight. It's a known fact of life that you can get away with a lot of things if you're hot. Actually, no, you don't just get away with it. You could be a one-note stalker and an abusive mother and still be one of the most popular characters in your game. Humanity has failed. To be clear, I don't dislike the idea behind Tharja. She's written as a creepy comedic relief who's just kinda doing her own thing and is an unrepentant sociopath. That could work. Mind you, in the same game, it does work. But she wouldn't be on this list if the idea was done well, would she? For one, I don't think Tharja's funny most of the time. She lacks the charm necessary to make her character likable. And when she can't fall back on that, I'm only left asking, what are you doing here? Why are you obsessed with Robin? Who would actually decide to marry you? Why do you have kids? What exactly is your damage? Well, her damage is that besides not being funny, her character does not work for Awakening. In a game where two of the biggest features are marriage and children, what exactly possessed them to write a character who's completely out of her element in both? She agrees to marry whoever she S-supports with, even though her attention is always set on Robin. And even S-supporting Robin results in a mediocre support chain which ends with a constantly uncomfortable Robin suddenly falling for her out of freaking nowhere. There's not a single support chain of hers that I enjoy reading. It actually gets worse, however, when she has a child that she uses as a guinea pig for her hexes and casually leaves completely traumatized. Still considered one of the good guys, by the way. If she was one of the few units who could only marry Robin and not have a kid, I wouldn't be complaining about this. Mind you, that's a role in which she fits better. She lacks any humor or any likability, and no, spontaneous acts of goodwill that are completely out of character do not help her case. Most characters I dislike from Awakening are simply flat, but Tharja isn't just one-dimensional, she's a highly unlikable round peg in a square hole, and yet she became one of Awakening's most popular characters just because she's hot. This girl's an obsessive stalker, but it's okay because she's hot and is also stalking me! Gotta pander to your fanbase somehow. Fire Emblem games occasionally bring back older characters for another round, but Fates went about this in an especially interesting way. 6 of the 8 most popular characters in Awakening came back with different names and slightly altered personalities. Conquest got Inigo, Severa, and Owain, and because they were the same people but more mature and in a new setting with new struggles, it went very well. Birthright got Gaius, Cordelia, and Tharja, except not actually Gaius, Cordelia, and Tharja. That went, Asagi, Selduri, and Rajat leave us with another tied entry, but I'm confident that I can get away with this one because while they each have issues unique to them, they all suck for the exact same reason. In contrast to the Conquest Awakening trio, the Birthright Awakening trio by design cannot do anything for the characters they were modeled after. They can't develop them further, they can't do anything interesting. Mind you, they actually lose so much of the original characters' nuance that it's kinda sad. Whereas Gaius is experienced and jaded but still lovable, Asagi is a walking sweet tooth who is also excessively whiny. Whereas Cordelia's humility intertwines with her low self-worth due to her longing for a man she can never have, Selduri is a laughably forgettable blank slate perfect daughter. Whereas Tharja is... Tharja. Rajat is Tharja but somehow even more of a stalker, because apparently that was possible. You made Tharja even more shallow. How did you... How did you? All 3 of these characters take a single trait of the guys they were modeled after, and there you go, writing department's clocking out early. There is an attempt to give each one something unique, but it relies entirely on their relationships with their fathers and does little to address their shamelessly reductive personalities. So what does that leave us with? Waste of space, whose only purpose is poorly written, thinly veiled, utterly inept pandering. Most characters on this list were just good ideas gone wrong. These guys, though, they were a bad idea from the word go. When it comes to Binding Blade's characters, there's not a lot worth complaining about. All but a few of them are bland and forgettable despite being part of the first game to introduce support conversations, but they're all perfectly serviceable, and because I didn't expect much from them to begin with, I can't bring myself to dislike them as characters. I do, however, expect something from the guy at the center of the story. You know, because he's kind of taking up all the screen time. Think maybe they'd try to develop him a little? Give him a little bit of personality? Anything at all? No? Okay then. Can I even rightfully call Roy a character? Can I really? His game focuses solely on him the entire time, and yet he does exactly nothing with the screen time he's given. His personality? What personality? He's the guy heading up this army because the plot demanded it, and he's the good guy because, yes. Every interaction of his is just discussing the current situation and... discussing the current situation. That's it. There's no growth into his role, there are no tough decisions to make, there's no indication that he's earned his position as a leader, nothing! For as much as I thrashed Erica and Ephraim, at least they had charisma. Roy, though, he has nothing. He is nothing. All of these support chains, all of this screen time, and he is a soulless void. Why is he the best Fire Emblem Lord again? Because his sword is on fire in Smash Brothers? Good, great. I'm glad we've all judged this character based on something that actually has nothing to do with this character. But hey, what do I know? Fire swords make all the arguments invalid. New Mystery of the Emblem Heroes of Light and Shadow is one of the series' most underrated games, if only by virtue of never getting localized. It built on everything that made the original Mystery of the Emblem work and added so much more, complete with a richer plot, additional character development, features that later helped save the franchise with Awakening, and even some completely new faces, one of which is your own customizable avatar. Sounds great, doesn't it? There's just one little detail though, that avatar is one of the worst characters in Fire Emblem history. My unit, bearing the default name of Chris, is added to New Mystery of the Emblem as a part of Marth's saga that wasn't talked about until now. That doesn't sound too bad, right? But what I haven't told you yet is that from the game's opening narration, the moment you boot it up, the game gets on its knees and furiously blows you for 20 consecutive hours in one of the most shameless slapdash self-insert fanfic subplots to ever share space with an official work. Hey, did you know that this previously unknown person was Marth's best friend and confidant, and without him Marth would have been completely ineffective? And that this person also happens to be... you? Every chapter ends with Chris being explicitly told, "Wow, you're really good. We couldn't have done it without you," conveniently forgetting that it hasn't shown that, just told. The story can't even keep itself firmly wrapped around Chris's erect penis without making Marth out to be completely stupid and impotent. Forget about everyone else in the Altian army like Marth's other knight and his fiancée. Chris is the only one who's making a difference here. Add to that a backstory so trite and insignificant that you can actually seriously choose what it is. Chris isn't just a void. They're an insatiable black hole that decimates the significance of everyone around them. Say what you will about Robin and Corin, but at least their inclusion in their stories don't read like a self-insert fanfiction. That's what Chris is, a bona fide self-insert Marty stew that puts the likes of Kirito to shame. And when that's what I have to say about a main character in an otherwise decent story, I can't not call them one of the worst characters in Fire Emblem. Close to the end of Awakening, the game gives you 6 side chapters from Spot Pass, with 5 of them giving you plot-important characters who are now joining your cause at the last minute. Bunch of procrastinating fun. The decisions made with these guys were questionable at best and downright stupid at worst, not the least of them being that they brought back Yin Fei. Awakening's plot deals in time travel shenanigans, which lets this one guy who died earlier come back later on because the one who's still living is from a different timeline. This means we have 2 different Yin Feis here, and we gotta talk about both, starting with the one from the present. When his sister Sei-Ri is introduced, she tells us that her brother has turned against her to side with the Empire, so you eventually have to fight him. And then you fight him. He won't listen to his sister, he goes down, that's the end of it. You'll definitely never learn why he sided against it. Oh, hey kids! Welcome to the Exilus Exposition Show! Yin Fei never wanted to serve the Empire, but Exilus blackmailed him into it by threatening to kill Sei-Ri if he didn't cooperate. So like Emeren did for Chrom, Yin Fei gave up his life for his family. But unlike with Emeren, I don't care. If I was supposed to feel anything over his sacrifice, shouldn't he have been introduced before the chapter in which he dies? The most you get beforehand is just that he's with the Empire. A sense of what he and Sei-Ri had, what he was like as a person, what he did for his kingdom. These are all things Emeren had that Yin Fei did not. So this whole scene is just weak. This actually gets worse when you think it through though. Sei-Ri rebels against the Empire. Exilus threatens to kill her if Yin Fei does not cooperate. Sei-Ri meets up with Chrom. Chrom and the gang take victory after victory against the Empire, which gets Yin Fei's attention. He is aware that his sister is safe with an army successfully fighting the Empire. Now given that, why did he not bail the second he figured this out? It's bad enough that he thought Exilus, this guy, posed a legitimate threat to him, but he didn't take the obvious way out of the bind he was in by entrusting his sister to a party with whom she was safe. Well, I draw one of 2 conclusions from this. 1, Yin Fei is stupid. 2, Yin Fei is really stupid! That doesn't just stop with the present one, by the way, because when you meet the future Yin Fei, he meets up with Sei-Ri, whom he lost in his future, and he refuses to associate with her. Let that sink in for a little bit. He spent all of this time looking to atone for his failure in his own timeline, and now that he has that chance, and the opportunity to comfort his sister who lost her brother in this timeline, he refuses because he's too busy brooding. Oh, but that's okay if they can support and make amends that way, right? Great idea, viewer. Apparently you're smarter than the people running intelligent systems because they didn't give you that option! The Spot Pass characters can only support with the Avatar. This badly affects all of them to a degree, but none worse than Yin Fei, whose reintroduction into the game sets up a scenario that needs to be resolved, and can't. The only way you're getting them to talk is through conversations in the Hot Spring Scramble DLC, locked behind a paywall. And I wouldn't blame you if you didn't even find them. You'd be hard-pressed to want to use a guy who's this aggressively bland and can't effectively play off anyone he talks to. Whether we're talking about the present one or the future one, Yin Fei is a squalid waste of a potentially decent character and the biggest moron in Awakening by some distance, to the point where not even the finest writers in all the land can put this broken character together again. Fire Emblem Fates' story. First of all, I'll be spoiling a lot of it here, so there's your warning. Second of all, it's not very good. It has some great characters and great moments and great ideas, but somewhere along the line a writer or two dropped some spaghetti. The question is, why? Why would a story with every advantage and all the potential in the world turn out this lackluster? Well, maybe you wrote a main villain who has minimal presence yet whose mere existence renders all conflict and motivations around him utterly worthless. Sounds about right. Anonkos' mere existence to me is baffling beyond any words available in the human lexicon. I struggle to wrap my head around how a story that had such potential could conceive a villain that goes out of his way to do every single thing wrong. He's such a perfect tutorial on how not to write an antagonist that I can scarcely believe that genuine effort was put into him. Build-up, personality, purpose, contributing to the story in any positive way, these are all places in which he fails. For 2 of 3 paths of Fates' story, the villain on display is Garen. Apart from one mention in Conquest, Anonkos straight up does not participate in the plot. He only gains a presence in the story during Revelation. Granted, Revelation is the true ending, but the main villain of the whole story doesn't even gain any build-up until halfway through the last of 3 paths. And then he's just thrown in there near the end, almost as if to be an afterthought. Now, given that, do you think he has a distinguishable personality or arc or motivation? Oh, of course he does! In the timeline where this story had competent writers, all of Anankos' background is relegated to DLC, but even if it was part of the main story, it's about as intriguing and consequential as decayed grass. He was the last of some ancient dragons and for some reason couldn't kill himself before he lost his mind, even though he foresaw exactly that. So, because Vala General ran out of bleach and a perfectly good noose was booked that afternoon, Anankos lost his mind, and now we have a possessed King of Nor and a war between the 2 major powers of Fates' world. I mean, his plans are awfully meticulous and minimalistic for someone stated to have lost his ability to think clearly! But sure, okay, convenience. That's good storytelling, right? This character is structured with all the elegance of a shattered vase and is just as appropriately scattered to the winds. Even with the attempt at a backstory, which is more than was given to the likes of Fomortis or Grima, Anankos still manages to be a non-entity. That alone would vault him into at least my bottom 5, but not being content with just 4th worst or so, he proudly digs his grave just a little bit deeper, the end result being not just a non-entity, but an anti-entity. Let's put it this way. When your protagonist has all kinds of opposition throughout the story and they have motivations for fighting you, how do you resolve that conflict? If you're a good writer, your answer would be to develop the characters on both sides. If you're these guys, however, you instead create a giant easy button that was repeatedly smashed like an abused spouse. Give it the vague and unexplained power of possession and you're all set! Takumi got some serious beef with you for betraying your birth family? Who cares, Anankos did it. Gunter got a problem with Garen and is taking it out on you? That doesn't matter, Anankos did it. Got a possible traitor in your ranks that you want to help and trust? Oh, that's no problem, Anankos possessed him. He did it. Is Garen a terrible warmonger who's also your father and has an actual backstory that could be fleshed out? Nah, it's actually not Garen at all. Anankos did it. We could have written a meaningful, morally gray conflict between the 2 nations our protagonist is torn between, and we could have resolved it with people actually learning and growing, but I don't feel like working until it's time to clock out. Anankos did it! By the way, the moment you snap possessed characters out of being possessed is also the moment their motivation completely evaporates because intelligent systems can write stories good. Anankos is the fallen domino that causes the chain reaction, killing the whole story's potential with extreme prejudice. It's one thing that he has yet to internalize concepts such as build-up and motivation. It's another thing entirely that his mere presence, which smacks of convenience and laziness, rings the death knell for any hope of satisfaction from this abortion of a plot. Concepts essential to crafting a character-driven drama are thrown out the window because of Anankos' very nature. Though the end result may not be an aggressively unlikable character, it left a large hole of missed potential in its wake because he only did bad things for the story he was in. Creating an easy out for all conflict involved was more important than writing a good story. Hope you guys are proud of yourselves. At least the final boss fight was pretty cool.